Over the next 2 decades, we'll live through the automation revolution. This is a period where large chunks of the labor market will be replaced by robots and artificial intelligence systems. Many millions will be thrown out of work, and chances are, you will be too. Modern nations and economies won't survive this unemployment bubble in their current state. They're not designed to. That's why in 2 decades, you'll also live through a second revolution in the creation of a new kind of welfare system, a New Deal. It's called the Universal Basic Income. Hello and welcome to Life in 2030, a podcast produced by quantumon.com that focuses on the trends and innovations that will shape your world over the next 2 decades. My name's David, and I'm your host. In this season, we're exploring the impact our generation will have on shaping the future of humanity. To that end, myself and a few experts will use this episode to explore the tools governments will use to support the hordes of unemployed workers that technology could soon make obsolete. The Universal Basic Income, or UBI for short, is just one of those tools. But first, some context. For those who are new to the idea of a UBI, it's actually surprisingly simple. The UBI is an income granted to all citizens, rich and poor, individually and unconditionally. In other words, it's the government giving you free money every month. And believe it or not, the UBI isn't as crazy as it sounds. It's already a popular concept among progressives and conservatives. It's just the details they disagree on. In fact, governments around the world are already investing in pilot projects to research how well this idea might work. To learn more, we called up our first guest.
Absolutely. So my name is Jenna Van Draenen. I am the secretary of the Basic Income Canada Network. So I'm a member of the board of directors. And that is the national network that promotes education, advocacy, and discussion around basic income in Canada. And I'm also an executive member of the Basic Income Earth Network. And that's an international organization made up of affiliates from 30 different countries around the world, all dedicated to promoting the same thing: education, advocacy, interest, discussion in basic income around the world.
We asked Jenna about her thoughts regarding the political viability of the UBI today. This is what she said.
Right. So, in terms of the political viability, in Canada, we've seen just tremendous interest in basic income recently. Something that I've been involved in basic income advocacy for 6 years in Canada, and when BICN first formed 8 years ago, it was a really small network, and just the growth we've seen in our network and the movement and the interest politically has been unprecedented. So I think the political viability, my answer today is very different than my answer a year ago would have been. I think it's very viable politically. We're seeing a lot of interest. To provincial governments in Canada have committed to implementing basic income in some form. Ontario as a pilot, and Quebec more as a widespread policy. And the national Liberal government has also formalized their interest in it, their national convention. And, we have health units all across the country, especially in Ontario and Alberta, who have endorsed it, dozens of mayors who have endorsed basic income, municipal city councils, medical officers of health, the Canadian Medical Association, and the list goes on. So it's something that I think people are realizing the time has really come, and it's a solution to several of the social issues that we're facing imminently as a society, and something that our government is taking very seriously. And I see a response in the Canadian public, also a widespread increase in interest and attention to this important policy solution.
Okay, so there may be growing support for the UBI among governments, but it's still a massive undertaking. And as you've probably noticed as of late, it's become rare that any new bill or law of substance gets passed in today's divided political climate. Politicians have become conservative, preferring not to rock the boat too often in order to stay in office. Given this modern reality, the next question we need to ask is, what will it take to make the UBI a reality? To explore this concept, we're joined by our second guest.
My name is Jim Pugh. I'm a co-director of the Universal Income Project, and we're working to raise awareness and spark conversations around basic income in the United States.
We asked Jim to share his perspective on the coming trends that will eventually force politicians to take action and make the UBI, or something like it, a reality.
So for me, it's not a question of whether basic income is or is not viable, it's a question of when. I think if you look closely at how technology is progressing, there's two big things that are happening. One is it's allowing us to produce and do things much more efficiently and ultimately cheaply than in the past, which is making basic and even luxury services more accessible. But at the same time, it's also not just beginning, and has already disrupted the labor space. And I believe will continue to do so to the point where jobs, as we've thought of them for the last 100 years or more, won't really make sense anymore. And if we're talking about a world where you expect people to be shifting between jobs or maybe not having work immediately available in its traditional form, it's going to be critical to have a floor that guarantees people's survival. You need to be providing that base that gives people a chance to figure out, what do I do next? Do I acquire new skills? Do I strike out on my own, do my own company? Do I spend time on other activities like art or caregiving or working with my church? It's going to be impossible for us to proactively say what are all the right uses of people's times. And a much better approach is going to be providing an income floor. And so I think as we start to move into that future and it becomes more and more visible, suddenly it's going to become much more obvious that a basic income is the right way to go. It's just a question of, do we do that sooner or later?
Sweeping automation, the need for an income floor. Building off of Jim's points, our third guest, Andrew Stern, former president of the Service Employees International Union and currently a fellow at Columbia University, shared his perspective on the trends that will advance the need for a UBI.
So the trends are fairly clear now of kind of what has happened already, which is that we now have economic growth and productivity growth without wage growth. And that is now just built into the system because of globalization, because of the use of technology and software that allows the elimination of sort of lower skilled tasks. But we also now have GDP growth and productivity growth without real traditional job growth. And so much of the growth in the 21st century, has been in kind of the non-full-time, 40-hour-a-week benefited jobs, and much more in the contingent, part-time, freelance, independent contractor world. And so we now have a jobs problem. And despite the reports on job creation and the unemployment rate, this election with Donald Trump and certainly Bernie Sanders' candidacy tells you that there's an incredible amount of anxiety in America. Only 21% of the people think the economy is good or very good. 47% of Americans don't have $400 in case of an emergency that they'd be able to find. And all of that, starts the discussion. But the real acceleration is all the reputable research that's beginning to appear about what technology is going to do to jobs by companies and individuals that are quite established in the economy, not on the left or the right. So you have McKinsey Global Institute that says 45% of all existing tasks can be eliminated by existing technology, 13% more if artificial intelligence can be commercially deployed. You have Oxford University saying 47% of all the jobs can be eliminated. You have the Pew study that talks about half of 2,000 experts that in poll think that the disruption will be so severe it has the potential to create social instability. The most recent Nobel Prize winner, Angus Deaton, Joe Stiglitz, Bob Reich, all kinds of established economists from the left and the right, the Citibank analysts, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. So we now have all this reputable research saying there is the potential for a tsunami of disruption in the labor market 1 to 3 decades from now. And to me, that understanding, and now the president of the United States has weighed in the same direction, means that there will be growing search for solutions to what are we going to do to provide stability in the economy and to provide economic security for people in a world where work and jobs are far less easy to come by, and certainly regular full-time employment begins to erode even more.
So there's a growing political interest in the UBI. Economic and technological tea leaves are saying that a UBI of some kind is inevitable. But how will a UBI actually help the average person? Well, from the perspective of the average Joe or Jane, the main benefit really is the money. But of course, there's more to it than that. To paraphrase and add to the points discussed earlier, by giving people a UBI, governments help people guarantee a minimum standard of living as it relates to having enough to eat, clothe, and house themselves. In other words, that underlying fear of scarcity, of not having enough to survive should you lose your job or get sick, will no longer be a factor in people's decision making. Related to that point, the UBI will give people a greater sense of well being and mental health, and that they'll always know that they'll have a UBI to support them in times of need. The level of stress this can remove from society is greater than most people appreciate. Similarly, a UBI can help improve a society's overall health by allowing people to afford better quality food, gym memberships, and of course, medical treatment when needed. Finally, a UBI will also give people more freedom to pursue more rewarding work. You'll no longer have to settle for any job just to pay rent. Likewise, you can also afford to go back to school to better adapt to the changing labor market. And for the victimized, a UBI can give them the freedom to leave abusive relationships. But it doesn't stop there. A UBI also helps businesses as it gives the poor and middle class more disposable income to spend on retail goods and services. It's kind of like a long-term stimulus package, but for society instead of for corporations. And when it comes to governments, a UBI could become one of their solutions to address the massive unemployment that future automation and AI will create. On top of that, a UBI will also help shrink the size and cost of government by replacing all existing social welfare programs with a single UBI. In the US, that means replacing about 79 means-tested social welfare programs with a single UBI. This reduction in the number of social welfare programs would also reduce government waste and fraud, create an incentive for people to immigrate lawfully instead of illegally, and will help simplify the tax and income laws. Alright, so the UBI has a lot of advantages, and it's already being experimented with in Canada, parts of Europe, and parts of Africa and India with a great deal of promising results. But, like most policies, the UBI has a fair number of detractors. The arguments against it largely stem from a Reagan-era stereotype that led people to believe that all welfare programs disincentivize people from working, that they create a nation of couch potatoes or moochers living off the state. This style of thinking also assumes that money is the only reason motivating people to work. Now, while this might be the case for some people, there's already a good deal of research pointing against the whole couch potato welfare queen theory. For example, a 2014 paper from Brown University called Food Stamp Entrepreneurs found that during the expansion of the welfare programs during the early 2000s, households owning incorporated businesses grew by 16%. Meanwhile, a recent MIT and Harvard study found no evidence that cash transfers to individuals disencouraged their interest in working. And two research studies conducted in Uganda found that giving cash grants to individuals helped them afford to learn skilled trades that ultimately led to them working longer hours. But all of this hides the even bigger argument against the UBI. It's the one you've probably been thinking about since I introduced this topic at the top of this episode. Just how exactly are we going to afford a UBI? Here, Andrew was kind enough to help us work through the math.
So first of all, I think it's important to understand that when we are creating a universal basic income, we don't necessarily build it on top of the existing safety net. We need to integrate it. And therefore, a lot of the revenues that form the foundation for funding come from existing social programs. So if, for instance, you're going to give people $1,000 a month between 18 and 64, which is my proposal, that begins to allow you to terminate a whole series of the 122 cash transfer programs provided by the federal government. Unemployment insurance, food stamps, other kinds of benefits that are now being provided in sort of a welfare safety net become part of the universal basic incomes foundation. And so I think for the $1.75 trillion that I estimate it would cost to provide, every 18 to 64-year-old adult $1,000 a month, you have $5 or $6 billion existing revenue that's being spent by the federal government on doing that. So that takes you about a little less than a third of the way there. There's another $1.3 trillion of a different kind of welfare, which are corporate and other kinds of tax expenditures paid for by the federal government. There are deductions that are given people for everything from second vacation homes to health insurance to state and local income taxes. The list goes on and on. But as the Simpson-Bowles Commission, which I served on, said, we can't separate that form of social welfare benefits and tax expenditures. And so you have another probably $500 billion of the $1.3 trillion. Now we're up to $1 trillion. And then my book begins to outline some of the choices you could make. Alaska has taxed oil revenues from the North Shore and given it back to people as a dividend. The same could be true for a carbon tax. The United States had a financial transaction tax up until the mid-20th century. Europe has brought it back. According to many economists, that's another $150 to $200 billion. We are one of the only industrialized countries in the world that doesn't have a VAT tax. Other countries have obviously done that, the national sales tax, in essence. That can provide substantial amount of resources before you even get to, is the military overfunded, and what do we want to do with some of the other governmental programs that are not related to social welfare. So I think there's plenty of money available, and asset tax would make the whole thing quite easy if we decided to put a very small amount of taxation on assets. So I think there is a way to fund it. It is not impossible and it is not easy, but it is doable if there's the political desire to accomplish that.
Replacing existing welfare programs, introducing more progressive tax systems, diverting military funding. At the end of the day, governments will find a way to fund the UBI once enough of the public demands it of them. But ultimately, the last resort argument critics level on the UBI is that it's a socialist extension of the welfare state, that it's anti-capitalist. And to be fair, there is some truth to this. But the UBI is far from anti-capitalist. In fact, it's due to capitalism's unsurpassed success that our collective technological productivity is quickly reaching a tipping point where we'll no longer need mass employment to provide an abundant standard of living for all citizens. Like all current welfare programs, the UBI will simply act as a socialist correction to capitalism's excess, allowing capitalism to continue serving us as society's engine for progress without having to push millions into poverty. And just as most modern democracies are already half socialist, think of all the spending on welfare programs for individuals, the welfare programs for businesses like subsidies, foreign tariffs, bank bailouts, etc., and then there's spending on schools and libraries, militaries and emergency services, the list goes on. Ultimately, adding the UBI will simply be an extension of our democratic, albeit secretly socialist, tradition. So what do you think? Will a universal basic income solve the future issue of wide-scale unemployment? Will it save our economic system from collapse? Or do you think it will create a nation of Netflix-watching couch potatoes? Send us your thoughts at feedback@quantumrun.com. We will publish the most thoughtful feedback on our website. Or post a comment in one of our Future of Work articles, also published on quantumrun.com. We go into way more detail about this topic there, and the links to all of these articles are listed in the podcast description below. A special thanks goes out to our guests, Jenna Van Draenen from Basic Income Canada, Jim Pugh from the Universal Income Project, and Andrew Stern, whose new book, Raising the Floor, How a Universal Basic Income Can Renew Our Economy and Rebuild the American Dream, is out now and available for order. The details for all of these guests are listed in the podcast description below. As for the music you heard throughout this podcast, it was composed by Carl Kutowski. Finally, want to support the show? Then be sure to subscribe, like, heart, share, review, and recommend this podcast to your friends. The more support we get from fans like you, the more often we can publish new episodes. It really does help. That's it for now, but be sure to join us for another episode of Life in 2030.